discussion on Election Commission's role in ensuring free and fair polls. The participants are Akshay Rawat, former Director General of Election Commission, and Vinay Kumar, journalist.
Assembly elections to West Bengal, Assam, Kerala and Tamil Nadu Assembly are on. Puducherry is Union Territory which will go to polls. All these states and Union Territory of Puducherry are witnessing multi-phase elections. There are sensitive, hypersensitive polling booths in both West Bengal and Assam, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Puducherry as well. Election Commission of India has a Herculean task of ensuring free and fair elections in all these states. If we look at the length and breadth of our country, ranging from northeastern Assam down south to Kerala and Tamil Nadu and coastal Union Territory of Puducherry, it's a huge task for the Election Commission of India to accomplish this democratic exercise in an impartial and free manner. Mr. Rao, if we look at the current exercise which is going on to elect new assemblies for West Bengal, Assam, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, along with Union Territory of Puducherry, how do you assess the vast expense and the responsibility on Election Commission of India to ensure free and fair elections so that, no aspersions are cast on the body and people have full confidence in the exercise going on?
You have already mentioned about the challenges that the Election Commission of India, as the largest election management body of the world, is facing. And we are talking in the context of these 5 elections in particular. And let's not forget that just a few months back, we had the very, very significant election in Bihar. And that was conducted in very special situations in COVID time. We are still in COVID time, and these 5 elections are there. And these elections, large amount of them are concentrated in the eastern part and large amounts are in southern part. And the issues are very different. If you go back to 1951 when the first elections were held, then you'll find the issues at that time were very different also. The country was just born. Illiteracy was very high, 16%. Poverty was all around. And the country was not fully free from the tensions of partition. And there were anxieties whether Indian democracy will survive. Many called the first election as a gamble, as a maladventure, and some who were more positively oriented called it an experimentation in democracy. But from that time onwards, when Mr. Sukumar Sen was the first election commissioner, in this very troubled situation, elections being held for the first time in independent India, but the elections are conducted to the satisfaction of everyone, all stakeholders. After that, till the time the 2019 national elections were held, now we are talking about state general elections. Elections have been held in this country, each time, every time and on time. And all the stakeholders, despite few murmurs here and there, some complaints, some grievances, before the election, during the election, after the election, little bit of reflection on EVM, on VVPAT, there was a time when capturing a booth was there, and the money part. Besides all this little reservation, and on which there should be legitimate debate, and it keeps happening. But elections have been held, and electoral democracy is something in India which has become an example for the world. It is not without any reason that Mrs. Hillary Clinton described the election management in India as gold standard. And now, undoubtedly, Indian elections are the largest such event management exercise in the world. And we have already seen it happening every time, and massive efforts and preparations go into this. And now, for example, coming to the elections which are being held now, they have already started. The polling itself is more than about a month, and in the very hard and harsh summer, when COVID has again resurfaced with vengeance in many parts of the country. In the context of elections, it's more important for 2 reasons. One thing is Tamil Nadu and Kerala, where elections are being held, they are problematic states in terms of COVID resurgence. But also, elections always trigger a heavy engagement of people. Rallies, campaigns, people coming to polling booths, all this happens. And any little slip by the election commission, by the managers, by the health agencies could really be a super spreader. So the elections are being held in the midst of all these anxieties. Then, of course, we have been seeing in the first 2-page polls how there have been lurking violence, how there have been lurking tension. The political opponents don't want to yield an inch to the other opponent. They don't want to yield anything. There has been some amount of decline in the standard of debate and discussion and mutual allegation and accusation. We are seeing that, and that makes really the election field very combative and more challenging because there is tension on the field. So though the Election Commission always aspires for fearless election, without any inducement, free election. That remains the motto. And that's what is happening.
And Mr. Rao, I think the challenge starts right from the day when the announcement of elections is made by the Election Commission of India. Then comes, as you rightly said, the law enforcement is a huge responsibility. And people would like to know that who acts as ears and eyes of Election Commission. And in a particular state, I will not name, Election Commission also changed the state police chief after getting some inputs. So all this is seen by the people as a confidence building exercise in which Election Commission of India's say or hold is supreme, so that, it inspires confidence of impartiality among all political parties as well as among the electorate. So for the people, please tell us that how these feedbacks and inputs are received by Election Commission of India and how quickly they are decided based on these feedbacks and inputs.
There are several provisions, Vinayji, and the Constitution under the Article 324 gives immense powers to Election Commission of India in the conduct of election. And the higher judiciary has always stood by the Election Commission of India in terms of any situation that might emerge. In fact, I recall one very important observation by the Supreme Court of India that in the Election Commission, in the election time, if a situation arises which goes out of control or requires some intervention, the Election Commission or CEC cannot just look at God and say, ask for the help. It has to act on its own. So it needs to have a good amount of powers and it has to exercise. So that time nothing is really contestable in the court during the election time. The election petitions can come after that. So there is a constitutional judiciary backup to answer your question, Vinayji. Then all the employees, sometime it becomes about 1 crore in the time of a national election. And I'm sure it is several lakhs in the time of these 5 elections that are happening on the ground. So all these staff, officers, whoever they are working, police, civil, even people who are, sort of deputed, they all are supposed to be on deemed deputation to Election Commission of India and all come under Election Commission of India. So they have to only take orders irrespective of the source of their organization, their authority. In the election time, once they are working in election, they are all subject to the orders of the Election Commission of India. Election Commission engages a superb system of observers, general observers, micro observers, expenditure observers, police observers, special observers. And these observers are the eyes and ears of the commission on the ground. So they are working commission on the ground. They are supposed to have a very close look at the election process and take part even in some type of force deployment. They take part in this. And they are supposed to inform and help the commission to act on anything that is going wrong. So that's important. And in terms of political parties regulation, model code of conduct, that's a unique document which is very special to Election Commission of India. It is not part of the law book, but it is a conduct to which the political parties have given their willing adherence. And that works beautifully in India.
And Mr. Rao, just to take one example, newspapers name a prominent political figure from Tamil Nadu who has been barred by Election Commission for campaigning over the next 2 days. So this kind of, let's say, punishment by the Election Commission of India or the restrictions imposed by Election Commission of India, certainly, as mentioned, use of technology plays a very important role. And then we saw some complaints coming from West Bengal where 2 phases of assembly elections have been held, and that complaints of rigging and constant, complaints to the chief electoral officer of the state. So if we take these 2 examples in Tamil Nadu, and there have been instances in the recent past also where Election Commission of India has stepped in to restrict some of the star campaigners of leading political parties, putting restrictions on them. When Election Commission takes such strict measures, its prestige, its inspiration amongst people for giving level playing field to all political parties and candidates and the people also, certainly acts as a very crucial and very welcoming factor for the Election Commission of India also. How Election Commission uses these censures or restrictions to ensure free and fair exercise.
The teeth of the Election Commission is something which you are referring to. And that's so important in the time of elections, in the conduct of elections. And perhaps this was made a little more established and demonstrated in terms of its strength during the time of Mr. T. N. Sheshan, our Chief Election Commissioner, and the Commission at that time. And it has never stopped becoming anything different. A commission like a Caesar's wife don't have to be fair and honest. You have to be also look to be fair and honest. And intervention is something which is the instrument given in its hand. Sometimes by surgery some blood may drip, but it may be necessary. You just mentioned about one or two actions, and there have been quite a few actions in the past, lot in the national election 2019 as well, and in the Bihar election as well. So unless there is demonstrated action, some people would criticize that it's just a paper tiger. In fact, with this level of action, if anyone wants to criticize, they can say anything. You see, very interesting, in a political context, Election Commission, at least as the umpire, cannot be in a popularity context. It has to do something which is correct. That's it. Correct, going by the law book and applying its best judgment, it has to handle emerging situation as it does. You and I, we all have seen how difficult situations can quickly emerge during the time of elections. It's a politically volatile situation. But in that, the level playing ground, which you mentioned, that is something very sacred, and the Commission has the responsibility to protect it. And also not allow things to become unlawful. The laws of the land are to be protected even more vigorously or implemented more vigorously during the time of elections. That's what, many people feel, that the laws which have to be implemented all time round the year, they are suddenly more visible in election time in implementation. The officers who need to be strict round the year, they are more strict in the time of election. That's the impact of Election Commission of India. And that's what we are seeing in grounding people from their campaigns, or putting some type of asking people not to speak, or issuing reprimands, issuing notice. And there is a debate going on. Should it be more? Should Model Code of Conduct have the legal teeth as well? Or is it enough? But I think it's such a delicate thing. I think the voluntary consent behind the Model Code of Conduct is its strength. And no one has till now disputed. And everyone has complied with any notice or action given under Model Code of Conduct. And it's the Election Commission which enjoys the trust of politicians, of all stakeholders, of anyone who is related to election, and ultimately the people of India, who are the most important actors, because the elections finally belong to whom? They do not belong to political parties. They do not belong to Election Commission of India. Elections belong to the people. And people have trust in these matters in the managing organization, that is the Election Commission of India.
Mr. Rao, what specific steps you think at the time of pandemic, last such situation around the world arose in 1918 and 20 when this Spanish flu was there. We are seeing an unprecedented situation. So, does it cross your mind that Election Commission of India, what kind of specific steps Election Commission has taken apart from the general guidelines which Health Ministry and central government have been issuing and state government have been issuing from time to time about masks, about social distancing? And everyone knows that, seeing Bihar elections, rallies, political gatherings, it becomes, very difficult to observe these norms. So what kind of specific guidelines you think Election Commission of India must have been able to enforce during this tough situation?
They have issued very comprehensive guidelines, and they have almost repeated whatever they did, good work they did in Bihar election. One very important, just for a quick example, is that the polling station, the maximum people that can vote was 1,500 historically. It has been reduced to 1,000 to maintain social distance. Then the health departments have been given a big role in terms of taking part in the election management. And then, of course, the amount of sanitizer, the mask and the PPEs, those special jackets and all, which are being used by election authorities. And every polling officer is treated as a frontline person. All election officials, all polling officers have been vaccinated. And the amount of all these technical necessities which are being used in the context of for election mechanism by election authorities, which are COVID protocol based or COVID appropriate behavior based, I think there are massive amounts of such facilities which are being used, so that the polling system, the polling officials, and most importantly, the voters are protected from any undue threat of COVID-19, and the democratic exercise can still go on despite COVID. This has been described by Election Commission in a very interesting phrase called leap of faith to hold elections at the time of COVID-19 pandemic.
Mr. Raut, we hope that Indian democracy is kept alive by all elements, all apparatus, all machineries which are at the disposal of the government as well as the administrative machinery and the Election Commission of India. Indian democracy, I hope all earnestness will keep its burning spirit alive in the years to come. Thank you for the discussion, Mr. Rao.
Thank you very, very much.
You were listening to a discussion
on US-Iran nuclear standoff and its implication. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
Today we are talking about efforts between the United States and Iran to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action better known as the Iran nuclear deal, negotiated and signed initially in 2015 between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations and Germany. To throw light on the implications of these renewed discussions, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, on April the 6th, the United States joined talks in Vienna, which were aimed at reviving the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which President Trump had withdrawn from in 2018. Now, since President Joe Biden has said he wants to return to this landmark accord, both Iran and the United States are trying to find their way to return to the agreed limits. Iran has said it will not meet the United States face-to-face till that happens. So now officials from the United Kingdom, France and Germany have been acting as intermediaries. Diplomats from Russia and China also attended discussions, and on 9th April, a joint commission meeting of the JCPOA members was held in Vienna, and the meeting followed a virtual and in-person meeting, and they have agreed to look at the US sanctions that were imposed on Iran, and another working group will develop conditions that Iran has to comply with to execute the JCPOA. So while it would appear that an important beginning has been made, it will take time and effort for both countries to revive the trust factor lost by the Trump administration's actions. What do you think, sir, are the implications of these talks for the region?
Nilova, I think I'll begin by saying that, there is a desire on the part of Iran as well as the United States to make a breakthrough. But of course, they both want it on their terms. And in the case of Iran, it's particularly important for the current government and the president, which is Hassan Rouhani, not to be seen as weak, because the elections are coming up in Iran in June. So obviously, they would like to at least show the people that they have stood up to the United States. And that's why the stance has so far been that the United States must lift its sanctions, which were imposed during the Trump administration, in fact, reinforced during the Trump administration in 2019. And now there are something like 1,600 of these sanctions which need to be considered. So that's the first issue. Second issue is that as far as the United States is concerned, Biden has clearly said that it will not be the United States which will blink first. It will be the Iranians who will need to comply and go back to the compliance mechanism which was set up in the JCPOA, which they have gone back on under circumstances which they said was actually not fair to them and that the others had not complied with the agreement. So both have a point there, and what will happen in these talks would be that there would be a role which will be played by the group which has been set up, which is obviously the group which also brought about the JCPOA, led by the European Union and plus the 5 other countries, who would go back and forth. They would meet the Iranians in the room, the Iranians would give their proposals, they would then talk to the United States in a separate room, or the United States delegation will come in when the Iranians leave. And thereafter, if there is an agreement which is reached in some form in which they can both accommodate each other, then there would be the setting of the working group. At that stage, everybody expects that the working group comprised of representatives at the official level of the United States and Iran, who would then be talking to each other and hammering out the technical part of the agreement. But the U.S. Point of view seems to be, and I think they would strive for that, is to reach an agreement before June elections so as to bind down the new administration, the new dispensation in Iran to this particular agreement.
Anil, Israel or somebody seems to have complicated matters even further in all of this, because somebody has targeted the nuclear facility at Natanz in Iran last week. The Iranians are accusing Israel, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, in fact, Lloyd Austin, visited Israel last week. So Iran is even suggesting that perhaps the United States had something to do with this. So is this kind of atmosphere of complete lack of trust, for want of a better word, is this going to really hamper things, do you think? I mean, how can these kinds of issues be resolved?
So I think as far as Israel is concerned, it's been a one-point agenda to try and sabotage these talks, because the Israelis are very clear that if there is any sort of agreement which is reached in Iran, even if it is limiting the kind of actions that they can take for enrichment, the eventual aim of Iran, according to them, is to go nuclear. And they have impressed upon the previous administration of the United States, the Trump administration, that this was actually the aim of the Iranians and that they should not fall for it. And that's what actually led to President Trump pulling out of this agreement in 2018. The current administration in the United States is more flexible. It feels that, there could be improvements perhaps which could be brought about in the 2015 agreement. And Trump administration had actually tried to extend this also to the missile facilities and to missiles in the possession of Iran. It seems to be a non-starter, and this administration, of course, is not so far pronounced itself on that. So as long as the old JCPOA is stuck to, I believe that there is room for reaching an agreement.
In the meanwhile, also China, having signed this fairly comprehensive economic and defense deal with Iran, whereby for the next 20 odd years, they're going to put in a great deal of money, about $400 billion, and revive the Iranian oil sector that requires funding desperately. So now, again, in that kind of a scenario, doesn't it become less important for a country like Iran to actually comply with a lot of the issues that the United States wants them to comply with?
Nilova, I would not pay too much of credence to that agreement because that's been talked about in the past. There is nothing definitive about the sum of $400 billion over 25 years. And it's not been spelled out in those terms in the agreement that has been signed. That is, now subsequently the writings that have come out have all stressed upon the fact that it remains a vague agreement. In fact, the Iranians would much rather prefer if they could deal with the Europeans and the Americans eventually directly rather than just relying on the Chinese, because the Chinese presence has grown in Iran and, obviously Iran would like to diversify. Their aim is actually to be able to talk directly eventually to the United States and also to be able to pursue what they call the peaceful nuclear program. So as long as this agreement is not revived, they will not be able to do that. So therefore, I think that's a factor, but a very small factor. And, obviously, the Iranians themselves feel that is not adequate.
Now, given that and the fact that, oil prices the world over again are in a fair deal of turmoil, what with the pandemic and so on, how does an agreement say, if the JCPOA is revived, how will it affect India, for example? And I mean, the broader region, of course, but also India. India would have certain stakes as well, wouldn't it?
Definitely. I think India will be affected in many ways. Mostly, I would say that it will have a beneficial effect on India if the JCPOA is revised. Why? Because first of all, it will allow India to import more from Iran as far as its energy imports are concerned. So oil, imports from Iran would definitely go up because the kind of oil which Iranian, oil fields have, the Indian refiners much rather prefer that. That's one. Secondly, in terms of security, don't forget that Iran was an important partner of Russia and India as far as the Taliban were concerned in Afghanistan. That issue is hotting up again. And if India is able to deal with Iran directly on that issue, it would be very pleased if that can happen. Thirdly, it's a question of, the opportunities which will arise for India vis-a-vis China, because at the moment it's only the Chinese companies who are operating in Iran. India is not doing that because of the threat of sanctions, even though they're not recognized by the United Nations. But then you have companies like the China National Petroleum Corporation who made deep inroads into Iran at the moment. That will continue to grow if JCPOA is not revived. Fourthly is question of Pakistan, where Pakistan would gain from the Chinese push into Iran. That has implications for India as well. And the extension of OBOR into Iran would not be a good development for India. Fifthly is the question of the energy security and also connectivity plans that India has for Central Asia via Chabahar for the North-South Transport Corridor, etc., and connectivity into Afghanistan through Chabahar again. So Indian investments into Chabahar cannot proceed unhindered as long as the JCPOA sanctions are not lifted. And finally, of course, there is the question of I would also talk a little bit about the, conversely, the non-beneficial effect, which would be that Iran would drive a hard bargain in future with India, as it has other countries which will, suddenly pay their attention into Iran, especially the Europeans, as far as investments into gas fields, oil fields are concerned. Secondly, the question of Indian companies. How many of the Indian companies will be able to trade and invest in Iran in food, pharmaceuticals, transportation services, banking, information technology, and construction? So Iran is a big market, and all these countries would look for the same piece of the cake, and that would make competition that much difficult.
Anil, the French Foreign Minister, Mr. Jean-Yves Le Drian, is coming tomorrow, April 13th, to meet with the External Affairs Minister here. And in those talks, it's almost certain that he will be briefing his Indian counterpart in terms of whatever little progress there has been or hasn't been in these indirect US-Iran negotiations. Do you think to that extent India can try and get its point across and say, make some suggestions there?
Yes, certainly. I think what India is looking for, as long as the JCPOA is not revived, and I think it's going to take some time before it's revived. It might even spill over after the elections in Iran in June, in which case India's plans for Chabahar, they will not be able to be fructified. So what India would like is to, continue that sanctions from the United States should not apply to the question of Chabahar, because of the connectivity issue and the fact that it affects Afghanistan directly, and at the same time the connectivity that India wants to create with Central Asia. So that's the point that India will make. Secondly, it will make the point that it has already invested a lot into Chabahar, and those investments should not go to waste, that these should be realized, and India is in the process of actually supplying more equipment to Chabahar and also to construct the connectivity road links into Afghanistan at the moment. So India would like them to continue, even though we will not be able to import oil to the extent that we were importing earlier. But at least the connectivity part of it, strategically, United States seems to understand that point as well.
So all in all, it is a fairly difficult kind of a situation at this point, and how this develops, and particularly those elections in June in Iran are going to determine a whole lot of activities which have a very direct bearing on India, wouldn't you say?
Actually, what has happened also internationally is that the International Atomic Energy Agency has got just 3 months in which it has to inspect the facilities in Iran. So Iranians also are playing, the pressure game through the international community, and of course they might extend it and later on say that we can do it for another 3 months, provided they see light at the end of the tunnel and they feel that there is a headway being made with the United States. But as I said, the elections would be an important marker for both the ruling dispensation and the opposition in Iran. I see it not being resolving, till the elections are over. But let's hope that it does, so that it has a beneficial effect on India.
So it's something that we will need to be watching very clearly. Thank you so very much, Ambassador Anil Vathwa.
Thank you so much.
Bring you a discussion on India-France ties gaining strength. The participants are Ashok Sajjanar, former diplomat, and Manas Bhuya, journalist.
Just wanted to know your take on the French Foreign Minister Le Drian's ongoing visit to India last night, and he will be in India till 15th of this month, April. It's a 3-day-long visit. So how do you see Le Drian's visit to India at a time we are witnessing a spike in coronavirus cases, both in India and in France? In the midst of the pandemic, he's coming to India for an in-person visit and meeting a number of dignitaries in India, including External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. So what is your take on his overall visit?
Well, you put it very correctly, Manas, that this is an important visit, and it is testimony to the strength of the bilateral partnership that Foreign Minister Le Drian has decided to make an in-person visit, to come to India to establish contact with his counterpart, to call also on the Prime Minister to participate in the Raisina Dialogue. Raisina Dialogue is now being held completely online. So the fact that he has made this effort when the pandemic is still raging in India, in France, in Europe, and several other countries, testifies to the strength and the vitality of this partnership. Of course, this is taking forward the relationship between the two countries, the high-level exchanges that have been taking place for quite some time. The listeners would recall that in 2019, we had the Prime Minister visiting France. He was invited to be a special guest at the G7 Biarritz summit meeting. This was after more than 10 years, in fact, that the last time that India had been invited was in 2005. So that was a very important visit in which a roadmap on cybersecurity and digital technologies was signed. Before that, we had the visit of President Macron himself to India in 2018. At that time, it was the membership, the participation of France in the International Solar Alliance. That was confirmed, and there was a joint statement on the vision of India and France cooperation in the Indian Ocean region, as also a joint vision for space cooperation. So I think this is a very vibrant relationship. Defense and security cooperation is one of the significant elements. Space cooperation and civil nuclear cooperation are also very important elements of the visit. You would recall last year when we received the Rafale jets from France, we had the French defense minister also coming to India for the induction of these Rafale jets into the Indian Air Force. So this is a strong relationship, and the presence of Foreign Minister Le Drian here in India is further proof of the strength and dynamism of this partnership.
In the last few years, we have seen a growing momentum in our strategic ties, particularly in the defense sector. But in the last few weeks, we have also seen indications of interest of both the countries to join hands and work together in the Indo-Pacific region. In the face of growing military assertiveness by China, there have been growing concerns internationally, and in that context, India and France have also shown public interest in working together in the Indo-Pacific region. How do you see the convergence of the two countries in dealing with issues in the Indo-Pacific, sir?
Manas, you used the correct word. There is a convergence as far as the position of India and France with respect to the Indo-Pacific is concerned. You would recall that France was the first country in Europe, in fact, first country not belonging to the Indo-Pacific region, so to say, which came out with its Indo-Pacific strategy in 2018. And if you were to look at that strategy, there is a great convergence between the position that was outlined by Prime Minister Modi in 2018 at the Shangri-La Dialogue, when he said that for us the Indo-Pacific extends from the eastern coast of Africa to the western coast of the United States of America. And this is exactly the position that is taken also by France. Secondly, France also has the added position of being a resident power in the Indo-Pacific because it has a large number of islands, a large number of territories. There is Reunion Island and many other smaller islands around it. In the Indian Ocean, there is the New Caledonian Islands in the Pacific Ocean. So across the board, it has a presence in this region. So it can definitely have a very genuine interest in maintaining peace and security in this region. So whatever are the fundamental elements of our Indo-Pacific initiative or Indo-Pacific strategy, if we want to identify it as such, having an open and free Indo-Pacific, having a rule-based international order, freedom of navigation and freedom of overflights. We also call for an inclusive Indo-Pacific. There is convergence between the two sides. And now that we have had this meeting, the first summit of the Quad on the 12th of March last month. And there I think it is being sought to expand the coverage of the Indo-Pacific so that it is not only maritime security that we are talking about, it is also in terms of the vaccine initiative that has been taken, 1 billion doses of vaccines to be manufactured by India with technology coming in from the United States and Japan, and also the financial contribution coming from there, and Australia chipping in with the supply chains facilities. as also we cooperate, the four countries cooperate going forward in the area of emergent technologies, whether it is artificial intelligence, it is 5G, or it is data, or any of the other emergent technologies. And in addition to that, of course, going forward, there'll be issues dealing with climate change, there'll be issues dealing with disaster relief. France has joined India's call for a CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So I think there are a large number of areas under the rubric of Indo-Pacific in which both countries can collaborate. And our listeners would also recall that when President Macron had visited Australia in 2018, he had spoken about a trilateral coalition between India, France and Australia, where we need to come together, and that would increase the strength of these countries, and they would be able to cooperate and collaborate in a wide variety of areas to benefit mutual advantage, and that would help to promote peace, security, stability in the region.
Essentially, sir, you have said that in fact India-France dynamism, which we have seen in the last few years, is moving forward at a very rapid pace, and it will translate into concrete cooperation in several key areas like defense, strategic affairs, climate change, education, environment, and several other areas. That is what you are mentioning.
Yes, exactly. You would recall, as far as climate change and environment is concerned, the Foreign Minister Le Drian is also going to meet, in addition to the Prime Minister and the External Affairs Minister, he is meeting Prakash Javadekar, the Minister of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. You would also recall that when in 2017, I think it was in June, when President Trump, the then US President, had announced his withdrawal from the Paris Accord. At that time, Prime Minister Modi was in St. Petersburg participating. He was the chief guest at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And he had flown directly from St. Petersburg to Paris to meet President Emmanuel Macron, who had just then been elected as the President of France. And then he had said that irrespective of what other countries are doing, but India will continue to meet its commitments under the Paris Accord. And that is also an area where both India and France are cooperating. The other area that you have mentioned also is of nuclear energy. And nuclear energy, both the countries have decided, and over the last few years, there are discussions between NPCIL, the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, and the French firm Areva to set up 6 nuclear power reactors of 1,650 megawatt each in Jaitapur. And discussions are going on. And once these come online, they will go a very long way in bringing clean energy to India and provide energy for not only India's consumers, but also for India's economic growth and development.
Our External Affairs Minister, he has been very clearly articulating that a new global order will emerge in the post-coronavirus period. And India has to be ready to play a vital role in that context. There will be renewed balance of power we are expected to see. And in that context, there will be different alliances that are expected to emerge. So in the post-coronavirus context, what kind of reinvigoration of relationship between India and France that you are looking at? And what will be the key areas, very specific areas of cooperation between the two countries in a post-pandemic period?
I think that's an excellent way of going forward, because since we have seen that leadership of the United States did not really come forward in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic when it started early last year. Now, China is trying to take leadership of the world, but of course its credibility has been very severely dented, not only because of the manner in which there was a lack of transparency when this pandemic started. So I think these middle powers that have to come together and that have to provide some sort of an architecture under which there can be peace and security can be established and can be promoted. In that context, I would think that both France and India have a very important role to play. France is permanent member of the UN Security Council. India is an elected member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years. Both of the countries have been collaborating, have been working very well on these issues that we have spoken about, whether it is the rule-based international order in the Indo-Pacific, because the center of gravity is now shifting very rapidly from the transatlantic region to the Indo-Pacific region. So cooperation between these two countries and of course other partners, including the Quad partnership, and of course going forward we can also look at the possibilities of a Quad Plus initiative, either specific sector-based or on a much broader base that other countries can also be brought in, whether they are some of the countries from the ASEAN like Vietnam, like Indonesia, or from out of that region like France or the United Kingdom. So I think those are areas that we need to explore. Also, we see that terrorism is an issue that has been plaguing the world. We will need to see what happens as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But India and France have been collaborating very effectively against terrorism. Your listeners would recall that when we had these issues of designation of Masood Azhar, the Pakistani terrorist, as a UN designated terrorist, it was France played a very important role because China had been putting this technical veto in the 1296 committee, and countries like France and also the United States and UK had told China that it will have to come out with the reasons why it was putting these technical holds and technical vetoes. Otherwise, in the Security Council, they will ask for an explanation. So I think our interests in a wide variety of areas. We have spoken about nuclear cooperation, we have spoken about defense security, space cooperation, economic and trade cooperation. There is a great convergence, and also in the area of dealing with terrorism, dealing with climate change. So across the board there is convergence, and I think in the post-COVID world order, both these countries along with their partners will play a very significant and very important role.
Next month, we are having India-European Union Summit in Portugal. So do you think our expanding relationship with France will also help us in boosting our overall ties with the European Union, where France plays a very, very important role?
I think this is very crucial. This is very critical to the India-EU partnership. You are very right. On the 8th of May in Porto, Portugal, the India-EU Summit is to take place, where Prime Minister is scheduled to meet all the 27 leaders of the EU member states. After that, he is to go to bilateral visit to Paris, to France. And I think that itself, again, that visit, if it takes place, it will be during the pandemic time, and it will be testament to the strength and the vitality of the partnership between India and France.
Thank you, Diplomat Sajjan Hart, for your time and insights into the India-France relationship and possible area of cooperation in the future. Thank you so very much.
Spotlight now, we bring you a discussion on innovative ways for raising farmers' income. The participants are Harveer Singh, agriculture expert, and Sanjeev Mukherjee, journalist.
Yesterday, the central government entered into an agreement with Microsoft to enter into cooperation with Microsoft for various data-related issues with farmers and to enable farmers access modern data systems. Harveer sir, how do you see this new development in the field of agriculture?
Sanjeev, you see that agriculture is really deficient of data and technology at this stage. Any new editing which will add more appropriate information for agriculture and farmer will definitely translate into the positive side of agricultural development and the economic benefit for farmers and the country in all.
Right. One big thing which always comes with data is that lack of information that we have about agriculture and agriculture data as such. Our production numbers are not very in sync with what the market says. We don't have a very robust system of real-time production data, which has been lacking. Do you see such kind of tie-ups with technological giants like Microsoft will enable farmers to give more real-time information about their production, about the crop needs, about the weather, etc.?
Yes, we have to see. You see, it is a pilot project for 100 villages in, I think, 6 or 7 states of the country. And, you know, Sanjeev, We have already done some experiment on this, like satellite mapping of crop. If you see some private sector is doing in sugarcane farming for that, mapping the crop production and yield and overall acreage. So these new things are the needs of the hour for agriculture sector. This tripartite agreement between Microsoft, Crop Data is another company, and the government of India. I think it will give a fair idea which direction we should go in future, because it will get a lot of persistent data, about the crop area, the status of the crop, and any requirement to the crop. What about the soil health? What kind of pesticide or nutrients the crop needs, when the crop is being sown or when it will get mature, and how we need to handle it up to the market linkages for all. So you will have a continuity in data collection as well the processing of the data. And now if we have this experiment successful, then we can replicate in the big way. You see, I think there are only few crops where we have this kind of thing. And there are some FPOs in Maharashtra doing this through geotagging of the field for grape exports and taking a lot of advantage on the price front in global market for that. And it cannot be done by the farmers on their own. For that, we need companies who have good knowledge and resource in technology, and we need people, those who are on ground from the company and the government side, and a linkage. So we need that kind of a proper linkage, and when we have to think agriculture also like a industry or like a business, where each and every information is relevant to get the better result.
And do you see more companies coming into this field? Because we hardly know of any company which has actually joined hands with farmers, come out with some real-time information which is beneficial to all the stakeholders in the value chain, not only just the farmers.
Yes, but you see, some new companies are entering into this field, basically in agri-tech, and some companies are working on the crop health and the quality verification of the product, as well as some companies are working in the field how to reduce the cost of production with the use of information and technology. I think some companies are based out of Bangalore and Chandigarh are doing this work, and in coming days, because it has a huge potential, and now the way agriculture is going to be with the new decision-making process at the central level, as well as the consumption pattern is also changed. Market is also changing very fast. So in that scenario, a lot of companies are seeing a good opportunity in agriculture sector as a technology provider, as well as to basically connecting the dots in technology, information, and markets.
One big drawback in this whole system has been how the post-harvest management has gone up, because we have very little information on what is stored in the warehouses and what is moving from the warehouses up to the market, who is moving that. Do you see all this changing because of such tie-ups and such agreements between the government as well as other stakeholders?
I think basically to collect all the information and data is a challenging task in a country like India with huge population and agriculture production. We need some kind of regulatory framework for that. Like we already have Warehousing Development and Regulatory Development Authority. So if we can assign the task to an authority like that, so all these companies who are collecting the data, definitely there must be some information collection center. And even Niti Aayog is also thinking about, because that there is a huge lag of information in crop production data. And even when the crop is also almost going to harvest, till then we continue collecting the data for crop sowing. So this is the lag. And if we have good data, so then the pricing, the market, and the decision making regarding marketing the crop. And as you said, the post-harvesting, because after post-harvesting, it makes a huge difference if farmers have good information, good resource and facilities, whether it is storage, whether it is processing, whether to connect the market. If he or she has good information, it makes a huge difference in his income from the same crop.
Right. And do you think when data is freely available of all the things, maybe the crop condition, the crop harvest, the post-harvest estimate, where the crop is stayed, it will bring more transparency into the system and the arbitrariness that currently exists, that people do make money out of this arbitrariness and this non-transparent way of functioning. It will help in that sense?
Definitely, you see, if you have data openly available to everybody in public domain, and there is a good transparency there also, and at the same time, efficiency and accuracy of the data will matter a lot in that sense. So it will be very useful if we move towards the direction. Transparency is needed, But at the same time, you see, we have a number of crops we grow because we have almost all kind of climatic condition or agroclimatic zone in our country. But at the same time, we, on the one hand, this private sector, we should encourage public-private partnership into it. And at the same time, this FPOs and other farmers bodies should also come together. We have large number of the cooperatives at almost all part of the country, and in large number, almost every second or third farmer is a member of any kind of cooperative. So we should also utilize that kind of network for this new change we want to bring to the data collection.
And they are also huge repository of data, the cooperative sector, the farmer producer organizations. They can also share their data into a public platform and all maybe into some common pool where it can be used and accessed by everyone, isn't it?
Yes, that's why even Niti Aayog also recently, when I spoken to member Niti Aayog, he told that we are also planning to create a task force because data is a big issue in agriculture. And this lag basically between the current data, if you see many experts and economists, when they present their paper, they use very old data, 2-year-old, 3-year-old.
Yes.
How can we do the planning and decision making based on the data which is 2-year-old or 3-year-old? We need latest data so that we can utilize that, because data is not just for making decision about the next crop production or the market. Data is also needed for making better planning, better decision making for the agriculture sector. So if we have good quality data, so we will be able to create good kind of rules, regulation and policy framework for the betterment of the sector.
Yeah, one big example is that many people in the system, even outside that, we don't even know what is the exact number of farmers in this country, whether it is 14 crore or 12 crore or 10 crore or 9 crore or 11 crore, because there are lots of numbers floating around at what is actual number of farmers in this country. But one question which always comes about is that people also say that we have very small land holdings, we have very small size of farming in this country, which doesn't make data collection and data dissemination in that sense very effective tool. Do you see that's a problem here?
No, you see, it is not a very difficult thing. If you see, in the recent past, what did we do? When Kisan Samman Nidhi was disbursed to the farmer, it is going into the account of the person who is owning the some part of land. There is a small plot or bigger plot, it is going. So we have a pool of data. We have more than 7 crore Kisan credit cards, which is supposed to be issued against a person who owns some land. So we have that kind of data. And even in Manrega, we have huge data on landless laborer and all. So a small farmer is not a big issue. You see, now in a country where you have created a bank for individual information like Aadhaar, more than 130 crore data is there. So it is not difficult to collect some 14 crore or 15 crore farmers data. And it is an exercise supposed to be done. You see, when this Land Leasing Act is there, and government also providing financial help to the states to computerize the data and land records for farmers. So these things are also happening simultaneously. But definitely we should have a deadline and we should complete the task till a particular date. And then if there is a deficiency, we have to cover it up in the next level of cross-checking and fact-checking. But definitely we can do this. It is not a difficult task for a country like India with huge capacity in information technology.
One question which always comes into mind is that when you have that, which we are also talking now of an agri tax using the PM Kisan database, where you have the database of all the farmers who own land and who do some sort of farming, and then you join it with Kisan credit card and all other subsidies programs which goes to the farmer. But the question here is that the issue of ethicity also comes. So how ethical is to share this data with, say, a private player? And a lot of people will be apprehensive of giving out the data if it knows that it will be used by someone for some other reason.
Sanjeev, privacy issue is a big issue and being debated in front of the parliament. Government is also working on this, what kind of privacy law we should have, because few years back or few decades back, nobody has thought about that. A lot of data will be there in public domain related to any individual, his property, his personal information and all. Definitely there is an issue. But for that, we need a good regulator and we should have a strong data protection law so that anybody cannot misuse this individual personal information for any wrongdoing and all, which can affect the person whose data is that available and being misused.
Even in case of the land records that has been recently started to digitize the land records and map them, there is an issue of confidentiality and also ownership, of transparency. How do you address these challenges at the ground level? Because people might not be very forthcoming to share those information if they know that things will come out in open. How do you convince that person?
You see that the majority of us in the country have their bank accounts. Now bank accounts are also digitalized and you can access through ATM or internet banking and all. Information collection to make it computerized on the land records is one issue, but sharing freely to any other person is the another issue. So definitely there should be a check. There should be a PAN number kind of thing, or like we have PIN for our debit card or credit card, and any other person who doesn't own that particular land and ownership, any other person should not be allowed directly to access the data except government authorities.
Right. And you said there should be a regulator to monitor that data so that there is no misuse and there is some amount of confidentiality. The people are also have that much confidence that they will share the data freely with the person who is collecting. Because we have many times seen that people are shy of sharing the data. And in agriculture, it is badly needed because if you don't share your land records, you don't share your production numbers, if you don't share your production estimates or crop you have sown, how much you expect the yield to be, then the entire exercise becomes very futile for everyone.
Ownership and particular land record, which khasra number or particular plot is owned by whom, that is a different thing. But in that case, to collect the data like crop production, crop area, yield, I think that can be the public domain because definitely we need. Without collecting the data, without utilizing that information which we procure to a lot of work, then benefit will not be there without that.
Right. Finally, from a company's perspective, from a business perspective, do you see this is a new and upcoming area in agriculture where high tech and tech and data is the field to enter for various companies in future?
Yes, of course. As we have discussed also, that it is providing a very big opportunity to IT sector to enter into agriculture sector. You know, many companies are working. I have seen companies, those who are basically assessing the quality of seed, whether what is the level of oil in the seed, what is the content, and the quality of tea leaves. And you know, it is some companies are providing weather information and regional information about the weather, and even very closely at district level also. So these kind of things and opportunity are coming to the companies. At the same time, this marketing side of the agricultural produce is also, I think, a huge opportunity for the corporate sector to enter based on the good information, good data, and to make agriculture more industrial activity kind of area where definitely agriculture should also be looked like a business where profit, loss and earnings and costings are each and everything are well calculated, and based on that decisions are being made even by farmers or the company or a buyer or even the government side.
Right. Hopefully the things will move in that direction and there will be more and more companies who will come forward because this is a very untouched and very new area for many of them. We know of companies like crop insurance and also insurance who have built up the whole value chain around the agriculture and rural areas, and hopefully many more will get into this. With this, we'd like to end the conversation. Thank you, Arvind sir, for sharing your views on this.
Thank you, sir.
Bring you a discussion on implication of Biden Suga meeting and beyond. The participants are Anil Vadha, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the meeting between the US President Joe Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister Suga. This is the first meeting that the US President has hosted in the White House since taking charge of the US administration, and both leaders discussed a wide variety of issues, but of course the major issue that everyone wants to discuss and was seen as being the major agenda between the two leaders is that of China. Ambassador Wadhwa, when we see the meeting between Joe Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister and the actions of an aggressive, economically strong China in the region, how do you put the meeting in that context?
I think both sides would be very satisfied with this meeting. From the US perspective, the fact that the Japanese president was in the United States with an agenda which matched theirs, and at the same time from the Japanese perspective, from the security point of view, from the pressure that they are feeling in the Taiwan Straits and also in the Senkakus, also the reaffirmation of the treaty between the United States and for the security of Japan, that's been an important takeaway from this visit.
Ambassador Wadhwa, when we see the fact that, Japan this time, it is being seen as for the first time that Japan has come out and criticized the human rights abuses in China, for instance. This is something that Japan has usually shied away from. Do you feel that Japan might be overcoming its past inhibitions because it has to keep in mind the fact that China is Japan's largest trading partner? Do you feel that there might be a shift in Japanese stance and they might be willing to come out and confront China more on more issues like human rights and other aggressive issues of the Chinese behavior in, say, the South China Sea? Do you feel that happening?
Yes, I think this is quite a departure from the Abe era. After the change in leadership in Japan, obviously the Japanese have come out more strongly in terms of talking about human rights situation in Xinjiang and also as far as Hong Kong is concerned. So perhaps in this process they've been goaded and helped by the United States, which also wanted references in the joint statement, and that is exactly what has happened because it has suited both sides. So having been to the United States, not talking about Xinjiang would not have gone down very well in the United States as far as Japan is concerned. From that perspective, this is a major departure, but at the same time, it also reflects the mood of the times in the United States.
Ambassador Wadhwa, if we were to look at Quad, and we have seen that President Biden, he also hosted the virtual summit where we had the Quad leaders participate. And now you have this meeting between the President of the United States and the Japanese leader. How do you see the role of Quad developing in the near future, especially keeping in mind China? Because a lot of people have said that Quad is also essentially an alliance which will keep China in check. How do you see that evolving?
So the security aspect of the Quad is of great importance to the United States in particular. And if you look at the joint statement, both Suga and Biden have agreed to oppose any attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. Obviously, this is something which is directed at China. And at the same time, they've been talking about the Taiwan Straits as well, which found a very prominent mention. So I think the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait, Japan and the United States, that's something which Chinese will take note of because that's also first as far as Japan and China relationship is concerned. As far as the Quad is concerned, we see that the Quad has now expanded its agenda to about 10 different topics. So it's moved away from the pure security perspective into other areas. And that's been done deliberately, in my view, taking into account the sensitivities of ASEAN and also other countries who are participating in the Quad, because that gives the Quad much more of a legitimacy and acceptance going forward. It also means that the countries of the Quad will benefit from this participation. That will be more of an incentive for a longer lasting Quad which can build upon its achievements.
Ambassador Wadhwa, do you feel that with the new U.S. administration in place and we have President Joe Biden, whose policies seem to be sometimes they're in sharp contrast to what we saw with President Donald Trump, do you feel that there seems to be again a departure from Trump policies even when it comes to China? Do you feel that Biden is willing to stick it out more and take on China more aggressively or more openly? Do you feel he's willing also to step up this alliance, Quad and other nations to confront a very aggressive and growing China?
They have adopted a cooperative approach to dealing with China and an approach which takes other countries along in the process. So in that sense, it's a departure from the Trump administration, which was primarily going it alone, concentrating mainly on the trade and economic aspects of that relationship. And therefore, we saw a concentration on the trade wars. And that led on, of course, to the security aspect where, because there was dissatisfaction on the trade-related issues, that we also saw this spillover into the Quad, centering of the Quad, also talking about a common China front. So I think the process started in the Trump administration, but that's been taken up by the Biden administration in complete seriousness with a certain plan of action, with a comparatively cooperative kind of plan of action, which takes others along and which makes sure that US is not alone in this process because they feel that's the only way to keep China at bay given its aggressive policies in the region.
Ambassador Wadhwa, we also see that one of the problems that whether it is the United States or it is India or any other nation in the world, one problem that one has dealing with China is that China is also an economic powerhouse today and every country is having trade and economic ties with China. How do you see US specifically and to some extent India also, how do you see this evolving in the future where we try to balance out the economic aspect of the relationship but also being able to push back China when it comes to issues like the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? How is this balancing act going to be played out in the future?
If you look at the Japan-US competitiveness and resilience partnership which has been announced during this visit, you will see over there that there is a whole lot of cooperation steps that have been outlined. The United States is well aware that unless the dependence on China is reduced for the countries in the Quad and even others in the region, that it would be a losing battle. And therefore, this particular document which has come out builds on the already existing relationship between the US and Japan, but it also goes on to commit a further effort in this regard. For example, in the case of next generation mobile networks, which is 6G or beyond 5G, for example, United States and Japan have both committed $2 billion to this effort. They've also talked about US-Japan cooperation in third countries to launch a global digital connectivity partnership to promote secure connectivity and a vibrant digital economy while building the cybersecurity capacity of their partners to address shared threats. Obviously, that refers to China. And also in terms of US and Japanese ICT experts developing global standards, that again is something which is directed at China. Fourth issue is on cooperation on sensitive supply chains. That includes semiconductors and promotion and protection of critical technologies. Now coming out as a main battlefront between China and the United States. Also advanced biotechnology. And finally, we also know that Quad itself has agreed on a landmark Quad vaccine partnership with Australia, India, Japan, and the United States in order to strengthen and assist countries in the Indo-Pacific with vaccination. Building long-term global health security is something which will appeal to the ASEAN states as well. So all this is therefore directed against the spotlight which was on China and to provide a sort of alternate as far as the other countries are concerned, knowing fully well that the dependency on China was growing and that this dependency needs to be brought down together with other countries. So the United States is going about this, again, as I said, in a very systematic manner.
Mr. Vadva, there have been people who have pointed out that the optics of the meeting that happened between President Biden and the Japanese leader, and this meeting took place just days after Biden announced a withdrawal from Afghanistan. It also provides us maybe with the most visible sign yet that the United States and especially Biden is now determined to shift the center of gravity of the US foreign policy to the Indo-Pacific. Would you agree with that assessment?
Both these things go together. The effort that the United States was spending in Afghanistan is seen by the new administration as something of a dead loss. And they feel that these are wasted years, that the United States had no business being in Afghanistan and trying to police what is happening in the country and trying to fight the Taliban. When there are other people who can easily do that. In fact, the Afghan government which is in place should be doing it. This is their point of view. It's another matter that, when they withdraw from Afghanistan on the 1st of August, what will happen to Afghanistan and the region in particular is something that we have to look forward to with some amount of skepticism in India. But the effort, you are correct, has been shifted to the Indo-Pacific because what is important for the United States is that the Chinese aggressive actions in the region, and I can name at least 4 different theaters. Taiwan is one, top of the list. Senkakus with Japan is second. North Korea and the region is the third. And finally, the South China Sea, where the Chinese have actually altered the physical structures and have stationed their radars and artillery on man-made islands. And at the same time, they have changed their domestic law to ensure that the Coast Guard of China can now fire in self-defense, as they call it. So that's something which impinges directly on the freedom of navigation principle in the South China Sea and goes against the principle of UNCLOS as well. Although United States is not a party to UNCLOS, but it believes in free and open navigation and commerce. And that's something that the United States is definitely prepared to defend. And we are going to see much more of a presence of the United States there in future.
Ambassador Vadva, what is the takeaway for India as an observer? We look at this meeting happening in Washington, D.C. between the two leaders.
The opposition grows to the Chinese aggressive policies, the better it is for countries who are affected. And certainly all the countries in the Quad are affected. As far as India is concerned, it's facing the brunt of it because it shares a land border which is undemarcated and a very long land border. And we've seen what has happened since Salman last year in April. And going forward, we're still struggling to settle, the existing incursions and the positions that the Chinese have taken along our border. I don't think it's a process that will end very soon. So therefore, for us, any check on Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific is something which is welcome. Any resistance to Chinese attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion, which is something which found mention in the joint statement of Japan and the United States, is welcome. And again, the focus on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, etc., are all areas which are of concern to all peace-loving countries around the world. And countries who believe in the rule of law will be happy that this conversation has taken place, and at the same time certain decisions taken to counter this aggressive posture by the Chinese. Finally, I think India should be pleased also with the mention that their core document finds the core partnership document includes a reference to the Quad vaccine partnership between US, Japan, Australia and India, with India taking the center stage of the hub of manufacturing for vaccines in the Indo-Pacific.
Ambassador Vadva, as you pointed out about the joint statement, and the joint statement which came out at the end of these talks very clearly said that we, that is the US and Japan, reiterated our objections to China's unlawful maritime claims and activities in the South China Sea, and reaffirmed our strong shared interest in a free and open South China Sea governed by international law, in which freedom of navigation and overflight are guaranteed, consistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. My question is that we have also seen that China has routinely dismissed or not really adhered to international law. Do you feel that this joint statement and the very direct message which has come out at the end of this meet might just push China now to abide more by the international law?
I think the progression towards occupation of islands in the South China Sea based on illegal claims has progressed to a certain point. It will be very difficult to dislodge them from the territories that they've occupied, even though this does not fall under international law. So obviously the Chinese will resist. But at the same time, if there is no resistance to this Chinese action, then of course unbridled expansionism. And therefore, from that point of view, the fact that there is an opposition now, which is growing, and if you see not only the countries of the Quad, but also countries who are in dispute with China and the others who are in the region, feel that this action is unjustified and that should be stopped in its tracks. So to that extent, I think the Chinese will think twice about getting more aggressive with other countries in the region. And unless this resistance by other countries continues, we will not be able to check this expansionism. It's a good development from that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we bring you a discussion on withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and its implications. The participants are Shashank, former diplomat, and Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
We're talking about US President Joe Biden's decision announced last week to withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan by September 11, 2021. Almost exactly 20 years after the devastating terrorist attacks on the US led to the launch of that global war on terrorism, which was focused on Afghanistan. The NATO troops will also be withdrawn along with the US troops. As you're aware, President Biden announced that it is now time to end the forever war, he said on 14th April. Its primary mission of denying terrorists a haven in Afghanistan. Now, in your assessment, Ambassador Shashank, would you say that that mission has actually been accomplished?
I don't think the Americans are talking of the mission being accomplished. What they're talking of right now is that, number one, 2 Republican and 2 Democratic presidents have taken charge of the American and NATO involvement in Afghanistan, from where they feel that the planning was done for the 9/11 attacks. Therefore, they don't want a 5th president to also get involved with this, which means that there seems to be some tiredness the way the whole thing has been projected, number one. Secondly, the Americans have tried both a surge under President Obama and then a decision under President Trump that he would withdraw all the troops suddenly. So therefore, in between these 2 extreme positions, the Americans are saying that, well, they will withdraw by September, and after that, while bulk of the troops will go, but some would remain for the security of the American embassy in Afghanistan. So therefore, some technical support, etc. may still be there. And basically, it is nobody's case that America or any external force has to provide security in Afghanistan on a permanent basis. Even Indians who were, according to some experts who were once asked by the American presidents or their senior advisors that they should get involved either in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in other places. So the Indians had at that time said, look, we are willing to go for developmental activities, social welfare activities, But whenever it is a question of involvement of the troops, we go normally with the UN decision-making process. We don't do it on the basis of plurilateral or our own unilateral things unless there is something direct impact on India. So that we'll have to keep in mind that if there is a kind of consensus which develops in India that we need to increase our participation in peacemaking in Afghanistan, we can think of that. But at the moment, there is a consensus apparently in India that we should not get involved in Afghanistan. We should allow the other regional countries and America and other NATO powers to work out the arrangements in Afghanistan so that they can strengthen the American presence or American support to the Afghan National Security Forces.
But Shashank sir, the point is that this decision would seem to indicate that there is no possible military solution and that the Taliban cannot really be sort of vanquished militarily, as it were. So they have to be perforce included into any kind of peacemaking process for the future of that country. Now, does this mean that, for India, the Taliban has always been a very difficult sort of entity with which to try and go into any business. So for India, which is going to be taking part on the April 24th Ankara meeting, what exactly does this really mean? The Taliban is calling the shots to some extent. They're saying they will not attend the Ankara meeting till the foreign troops are all out. But if they do attend, it isn't really the best of news for India, at least.
Well, quite right. This is really a worrisome position for India at present, that Taliban seem to be gaining the upper hand, number one. Secondly, Taliban have had support from the Pakistani security establishment who are feeling self-congratulatory to see that how they can increase their position in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And countries like Qatar, Turkey, and maybe some other regional powers, they feel that they can play a more important role. With India, the situation is that, we have spent a lot of money in social welfare and developmental activities in Afghanistan. We would not like that to go completely waste. That's number one. Secondly, Taliban have two identities. One is the Islamic identity plus the control by the Pakistani security establishment. And the second one is that many of them are Pashtuns. And Pashtuns generally don't have, if you find the general public in Afghanistan, they have very sympathetic and friendly feelings towards the Indians. So it is not that as such they are anti-Indians. But the point is that when it becomes a combination of the Taliban as Islamic forces, plus whatever support they get from the other Islamists elsewhere, and the Pakistani security establishment, then they try to do this. So we have to put pressure on Pakistan to behave in a more responsible manner. Secondly, we have to work along with the other regional countries to make sure that Taliban, or there are supposed to be about 22 groups which are fighting in Afghanistan for control over different parts of the Afghan territory. So we have to just make sure that they all try to behave more responsibly and do not keep Afghanistan unstable all the time.
But Ambassador, that is easier said than done. And all said and done, India does have extremely legitimate stakes in Afghanistan. We've invested well over $2.3 billion there in, as you said, a lot of infrastructure and other social works. And we do have, on average, the Afghan has a good impression of India and is favorably inclined. But Pakistan, as you rightly said, has been constantly trying to be inimical to India and trying to keep it out of Afghanistan in any which way. We were also the first country to have the strategic partnership with Afghanistan, as you know.
Not only strategic partnership with Afghanistan, but also we developed a trilateral partnership with Afghanistan and Iran. And the Shah Bahar port and the infrastructure linkages going up to Afghanistan and beyond into Central Asia, they were all developed, and we got a special dispensation from the Americans that there will be no sanctions imposed on this infrastructure connectivity despite whatever their LISA or ISA Act is there in the American Congress against Iran. Therefore, we have a real, we must work hard on this. It's not an easy situation. We have many people in India who have personal friendships with people in Afghanistan. And we must try to build up on those friendships. Then we have friends in many of the countries in the Gulf and in Central Asia. We should build up on these friendships. And we cannot make out a case that Americans have to stay there permanently. That would be a very weak position to be taken by a country like India, that a foreign country should keep permanently control over the sovereignty of Afghanistan. Therefore, we have to give the primary role to Afghanistan. Then the regional countries have to come together to make sure that Afghanistan, whatever achievements have been made, particularly, let's say, in their democratic processes, particularly for their women education, their women getting into the various activities, social and official activities. So I think there should not be reversal on all that.
No, I completely agree with you, and I appreciate what exactly it is that you're saying, Ambassador. But the point is that if so many rounds of talks, I mean, as far as I'm aware, there have been 23 rounds of separate talks and all that were happening between the various groups led by the United States in that effort. Despite all of that, the Taliban and the inter-Afghan conversation has not really even begun per se. So what will really make that change? I mean, the Afghan defense minister was in Delhi last month, and he was fairly candid in saying that President Ghani is absolutely adamant that there have to be elections first, and then there would be any other processes of dialogue and resolution. And the situation today is different from what it was 20 years before. But the Taliban does not seem to accept that. So why would they now want to change, especially since they see this as a possible victory with the United States declaring it will leave?
Well, that is true that the Taliban feel it's a victory for them. That kind of a victory is a Pyrrhic victory. It will not help them at all. And Afghan people also are staunchly nationalistic people, number one. If you recall that originally when Pakistan was to be given recognition in the United Nations, the only country which did not agree to do that was Afghanistan. And we have to keep those things in mind. I think there is a feeling in India that really we cannot allow Indian security interests to be jeopardized in any way. And therefore we have taken a view that there are no good negotiators and no bad Taliban. So I think we need to build also linkages with the various people. The government may not be able to do that straight away, but I'm quite sure that we must be having many academics, many journalists, many other people. And also we have many of the people of Indian origin living in different parts of the Gulf and other places. We need to work through them. And then we have many friends, really in this region. In Afghanistan, if you remember that the Northern Alliance, along with Iran and India and Russia at one time, had been able to create the situation for a democratic form of government in Afghanistan. Later on, we withdrew and gave priority to the NATO and the United States.
Ambassador, as you said, the Gulf countries, the regional countries have been very active even in the background. And in fact, today, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar is in Abu Dhabi, as is the Pakistani Foreign Minister. And there are reports that the two of them are likely to be in a meeting sort of brokered by some well-wishing third parties like the United Arab Emirates. Is Afghanistan, do you think, a core issue of what they will be talking about in these discussions?
I don't know really, because these are discussions which have not been confirmed by either the Pakistan side or the Indian side. The UAE is the only one which has said that they are trying to work behind the scenes to bring about a dialogue between India and Pakistan. That if this dialogue takes place, it must include the issue of no terrorism in India, no terrorism in Kashmir, and then of course Afghanistan, because we have seen all these people who have moved, terrorists who have moved from Middle East, they are trying to move into South Asia and Southeast Asia. And therefore, it's an extremely important thing where Americans can simply say that, all right, there are so many thousands of kilometers away from Pakistan that Pakistan made a fool of them and collected billions of dollars. But UAE is nearby, Saudi Arabia is nearby. They cannot allow to do this. They have already withdrawn their assistance programs to Pakistan. So I think they are in an important position to use their leverage on Pakistan.
The other problem is, of course, as you said right at the outset, the basic problem, even the CIA director, William Burns, has sort of accepted that the US withdrawal will come with a significant risk that groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda might again try to rebuild their presence in Afghanistan. And for them, plot attacks against US interests. But for us, it's very worrisome because if Afghanistan descends into that kind of chaos, the spillover effects in our region, I mean, not only into Pakistan, but legitimately into maybe places like Kashmir and all that in India is a huge worry.
We really have to make it very clear that India has been a soft power all this time, but we should be able to exercise hard power as we have done. We should tell them very clearly that if the Afghans want any kind of help from us, we should be quite willing to do that, except for putting boots on the ground or sending our instruments there, but we can give all kinds of technical support that the Afghans want. We should be quite willing to go ahead in that direction and gradually build a consensus in India in favor of a harder line so that whether it's ISIS or whether it is Al-Qaeda or others, they do not think in terms of converting India into the base for their Ghazwa-e-Hind or whatever they want to do, an Islamic state in South Asia.
Because that is a very legitimate and a long-lasting worry that all strategic thinkers and the Indian establishment, I'm sure, is extremely worried about. But I suppose we should wait and watch and see what happens in Ankara on the 24th of this month. If the Taliban perhaps joins in those talks, are you at all hopeful that there will be some forward movement?
Well, for the time being, they are doing their shadow boxing kind of thing. They are asking the Americans to leave by May. So still, maybe it's a bit too late for them to continue asking for this demand needs to be revised, first of all, and then they can talk about something which is more reasonable. I think they are perhaps trying to extract as many concessions as possible from the Americans. So the domestic situation, America makes it necessary for them to withdraw one way or the other.
So then I suppose the situation continues to remain very, very sort of uncertain, and we're not sure looking ahead what exactly is going to happen. I guess this is one of those situations where India doesn't really have too much to do but to wait and watch. Would you agree with that, Ambassador?
I will agree with that. Only thing is that we don't want Americans, as they had tried to build a kind of a dialogue between India and Pakistan for Afghanistan and Kashmir, that we don't want them. So without that kind of a scenario, we can think in terms of the direct impact on the Indian security. And for that, if we have to carry out any kind of dialogue with the neighboring countries or with USA or NATO powers and all that, we should be quite prepared to do that. And we should also bring into this calculation this new Quad formula that we are thinking of as to what does it mean for us. I mean, if you are thinking only of maritime security, does that mean security for India also? Does it mean security only for some American allies in that region, in this South China Sea area?
I think we've sort of come up today with as much as we can. We'll thank you so very much, Ambassador Shashank.
Thank you.
You will a discussion on regime change in Cuba. The participants are Rangaraj Vishwanathan, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the change that has taken place in Cuba, with Raul Castro announcing that he is resigning as the Cuban Communist Party leader, which eventually ends his family's 6 decades in power. The move, which was expected, also ends the era of formal leadership by him and his brother Fidel Castro, which began with the 1959 revolution. Ambassador Vishwanathan, when you see this change happening in Cuba, how do you look at this? Do you feel that this is now the end of an era and the end of what we saw, a very powerful phase with both the Castro brothers, and there was this revolution which was there since 1959? Do you feel that with Raul Castro now stepping down, there would be a fundamental change in Cuba, or do you feel it is not going to change so much?
A planned change, not a historic change, is not going to create a disruption or a transformation or a revolution. It is all pre-planned. Of course, the name of Castro won't be there in formal official titles, but this Miguel Diaz-Canel, who has taken over as the chief of the Communist Party, he has been trained and groomed by the Castros over the last 5 years or so. Although he was born after the revolution in 1960 and belongs to a totally different generation from the revolutionary generation of Castros, he has been trained, and the Castros have confidence in him that he is not going to upset the system like Gorbachev did in Russia. So it is as a known and trained and a person of trust and confidence of the Castros. So I don't expect any significant changes as long as Raul Castro is behind the scenes. He doesn't have titles, but he is still around.
Ambassador Vishwanathan, do you feel that the philosophy of socialism, communism, thing which will continue to rule Cuba, as you said, Raul Castro will remain behind the scenes? There might be a slight change, or we might see the beginning of a movement where you move away from the socialism, communism ideals. It's not going to change much, and Cuba will continue to hold whatever philosophy it has held for such a long time.
Well, it has been proven in history that 100% pure socialism and communism, or for that matter even 100% capitalism, cannot survive. So they need to adapt, they need to change, they need reinvent. We have cases like Russia, we have China, we have Vietnam, and of course, we have an exceptional case of North Korea, which is totally different. The Cubans have learned from Russia that you open up suddenly and you lose control. And the opponents of the revolution would take advantage. And the Cubans in Florida and the US administration would be merciless, like they have been with Russia. At the same time, they have learned positive elements from China, from Vietnam, and I would say even Singapore. You don't need elections, voting, proper democracy. Right? Singapore is flourishing, and it is not a proper democracy. Now, China has unleashed the entrepreneurship of the people, allowing them to make money, become rich, and live a good material life without changing the political system. And this is being followed by Vietnam also. So the Cubans have studied these, the negative example of Soviet Union and the positive example of China, Vietnam, and Singapore. And they are preparing to gradually open up and transition. But the only thing is, they are a poor country and the system doesn't allow them to prosperity in immediate way. So they are struggling. They don't have natural resources. And earlier, their pattern was, their main problem, apart from the internal system, was United States, which sort of kept Cuba poor and isolated by the sanctions, which was ruthless. Now, they survived with the support of Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, then Chavez came to their rescue. And Chavez gave them petroleum and money and material and moral support. That continued, which is being continued by Maduro also. But Venezuela is in much deeper trouble than Cuba now. So that window is also closing and it has become uncertain. And without the external support and limited scope for internal reforms, I guess Cuban people will continue to face challenges, problems of food, problems of consumer goods in the coming years.
Mr. Vishwanathan, when we speak of China and to some extent even of Singapore, do you feel that when we look at China and Singapore, we are also then looking at the absence of a lot of freedom, like the freedom of speech and expression, the controls on media, the controls on social media? How do those things then come into play? So how does one grow economically but keeping the liberties of the individual also intact? That not be a challenge. While we look at the positives, this would also be the negatives going forward for Cuba.
But Cuba is different. Cuba is part of Latin America, where people are more fun-loving and more relaxed and more into. Cubans are very talented people in music and dance and literature, sports, even in science and technology. They have advanced technology in certain niche areas of medicine and biotechnology. Right now, they are also developing vaccines for COVID. And our company called Biocon has got joint venture with Cuba, using Cuban technology for producing biotech products. So there is this particularity of Cuban people, which is totally different from the Chinese. But generation of Cubans have been brainwashed, indoctrinated, and they have lived in the strict, rigid communist system. So mentally, they have also been conditioned. One doesn't know if the new generation will sort of get a fire in the belly and rise up against them. But I don't expect it in the next few years. Maybe after Raul Castro dies, maybe after another decade or so, there could be changes.
Mr. Vishwanathan, when we talk of Cuba, one of the important relations that Cuba has always shared is with the US, and it hasn't been a great relationship. We have seen that when Fidel Castro was in power, the United States and Cuba, they were constantly at loggerheads. We did see some improvement and thaw in ties when Obama became president, and there was this softening of ties, and Obama also went to Cuba. We saw President Trump then taking the step back again and reimposing the embargo. Do you expect that under the new US President Biden, do you feel that this could go back to the Obama time when ties between Cuba and US will be less confrontational, and this might ease things for Cuba a little bit?
Whatever Obama and Biden had achieved earlier, he reversed everything. But now Biden, who was involved in the Obama's opening to Cuba, he is in power. So the expectation is that, yes, he is definitely going to reverse the extremist policies of Trump. But the only thing is there has not been any significant statement about opening to Cuba. Obviously, they have other priorities of China, Russia, so many other issues. So Cuba has not been in the radar of the Biden administration. But surely things will ease, and Obama has admitted the mistake of United States in suppressing Cuba with the unfair and unjust sanctions and the isolationist policy, and so many covert and overt programs to assassinate Fidel Castro and harm the country. He had admitted the mistake, and it was a correction needed on the part of United States. And that correction, which was initiated during Obama's time, I guess it would be put in motion sooner rather than later by the Biden administration. And the Cubans, of course, would welcome any opening from the United States. They are desperate.
Do you also feel, Ambassador Vishwanathan, it is a generational change? The generation which saw Fidel Castro come to power and the revolution take place, today the majority of Cubans are born after that. People are maybe not that drawn towards socialism as they were during that time. Do you feel that subtle shift, that generational shift will lead to also maybe a softening of bilateral ties somewhere?
Cubans, they no longer live by the staple diet of revolution, socialism or death, those kind of slogans. They are open and they see what's happening around the world. They have greater exposure and their mindset is different, as you said. So this would also accelerate Cuba's own gravitation towards United States and to the world in general.
Ambassador Vishwanathan, we've also seen that Cuba, when it comes to the fields of education and healthcare, and you were also referring to its participation in the development of the corona vaccine, we have seen that Cuba actually excels when it comes to education, especially healthcare. Do you feel that this is also an outcome of the way the state has grown?
Certainly, healthcare are two sectors which are kind of poster achievements of Cuba. Healthcare for everyone and high literacy rate. And in healthcare, they have not only done well for them, but have also gone outside and punched above their weight in providing medical education and healthcare for the rest of the world. Like they have trained thousands of doctors from Latin America, and even some Indians have gone there for medical education. Once I remember, the Cuban vice minister was on a visit to India and he suddenly fell sick and we admitted him to Gangaram Hospital. And guess what? The doctor who came to see the vice minister spoke perfect Spanish. He had gone to Cuba on a scholarship. So like that, the Cubans have provided free medical education to thousands of students, especially from Latin America and to other parts of the developing world. And they also sent their health workers, doctors, to many countries, to disaster zones. Like they even sent doctors to Italy at the height of COVID issue last year. And so this is part of their, like we talk about vaccine diplomacy, theirs is the healthcare diplomacy, and they have been successful. And they also provide the training even in sports. Like I think even in India, we had quite a few trainers from Cuba for some of our athletes. So there are certain niche areas in which they have made great achievements.
Ambassador Vishwanathan, we've seen that in Cuba, the tourism sector has always been one of the country's healthy sectors which has brought in people and money. But we've seen that because of the coronavirus pandemic, this has practically shut down Cuba's tourism sector and had caused an 11% economic contraction last year. The crisis has also triggered food shortages which have brought back memories of the early 1990s. And we've also seen, because of this food shortage, there have been calls for more political freedom in Cuba. Do you feel that all these factors will somehow get together and make Cuban leaders maybe move a little faster in opening the economy, or do you still predict that we will see a more gradual opening of Cuba and this is going to take a while before we see a significant shift in Cuba?
The Cubans have lived with the crisis one after the other from the revolutionary days, from 1950. They have survived and they have great capacity and resilience to suffer through misery and survive. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't expect. So that was a shock. They survived it. They have also great capacity for sacrifice besides resilience. So I don't think this suffering and the problems and challenges now are anything new or in greater scale than what they had faced in the past.
Ambassador Vishwanathan, if you look back since 1959 and see first Fidel Castro and then Raul Castro, how would you look at this era when we've seen very powerful, very charismatic figure of Fidel Castro with his cigar and, as the leader of Cuba, then his brother. How do you sum up this era for the present generation?
Bunch of youngsters taking a boat and from Mexico to Cuba and overthrowing a government with a large military force. That was sensational. And then afterwards, the Bay of Pigs and all the American interventions overturned covered. The way Cuba survived, defended itself, and then went on the attack, that was dramatic. The Cuban Revolution was an iconic revolution, a historic revolution in the history of the world and for Latin America. They proved to the world that a small, vulnerable country can withstand the coercive power of a big bully with strength, with cleverness, with the diplomacy. In the world history, it's the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro would remain as something memorable, something of an inspiration, although that was a different time.
And with this,
Now we bring you a discussion on role of India and US in ensuring peace and stability in Afghanistan. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
The peace and stability in Afghanistan following the US decision to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, and also the implications and how India and the United States can contribute to the peace and the long-term stability in Afghanistan. We've seen in the recent years and almost decades how Afghanistan has been ravaged by war. We have also seen India's role in helping build Afghanistan in humanitarian assistance and in various other programs. Ambassador Wadhwa, when we see the United States ready to pull out its troops from Afghanistan, it will leave a vacuum in the country. What, in your opinion, should be the major concerns for India and the United States once this withdrawal of troops is completed?
The decision by United States to pull out of Afghanistan has been taken much earlier, but it's only now that the Biden administration has actually implemented what was already decided by the Trump administration. And in order to make sure that the United States left Afghanistan quickly as possible, the United States, in effect, started talks with the Taliban starting in 2019, using Doha as a platform. And of course, the Afghan government was not involved in this process. It's only in 2020, and after enormous amount of pressure by the United States on the current Afghan government, that the government of Ashraf Ghani spoke to the Taliban for the first time towards the third quarter of 2020. And of course, there was no agreement with the Taliban and the current government, because the Taliban now sees itself in a position of strength, and the fears that you mentioned are many. First of all, there is a fear that the Taliban would impose its will in Afghanistan and would bring about a sort of Sharia rule which they wanted to from the very beginning. Second issue is how this will have a fallout on the status of women and children in Afghanistan, on the humanitarian issues which go with it. Third issue is about the growing role of Pakistan and the use of Afghanistan as a base of terror against its neighboring countries, and that includes India, Iran as well. The worrying part is that the Russians seem to have come to the conclusion that unless they take Pakistan along, that they will also be affected by the instability that could then spring from Afghanistan into their own country. And therefore, they've gone along with the current arrangement, which gives Pakistan a sort of vantage point, along with China, who would like to use Afghanistan as an outlet for its BRI policies and also to exploit the natural resources in Afghanistan. Therefore, in sum, what it leaves the Afghans with is nothing much at hand, very little hope for the future, and there is a big challenge now on how to manage this transition.
Mr. Wadhwa, as you pointed out about Pakistan, and we have seen there is this great concern globally that once the US troops leave and we'll also have the NATO troops withdrawing, the vacuum that is left behind makes Pakistan even stronger in the sense that Pakistan and Taliban have always had very deep ties, and Pakistan might be running a lot of regional concerns in this nation. How do you think India and the United States can counter this influence of Pakistan, which is likely to grow, especially for India, given the fact that Pakistan has used foreign soil to plan attacks against India?
The United States is not looking at it from the perspective that India looks at it, because India is next door to Pakistan and to Afghanistan and is a regional player. And as far as the United States is concerned, it is an election promise of President Biden to bring back troops from Afghanistan and to ensure that there is no more continuation of spending in Afghanistan. Because if you look at it from their perspective, $143 billion have been sunk into Afghanistan as far as there are 30,000 casualties and 2,400 fatalities in Afghanistan. And then on top of that, there is no improvement they see in the human development, which is very limited on the ground. The future prospects from their point of view remain very mixed. So the stakes for the United States in this region are not very high. And all they're interested in at the moment is to make sure that the withdrawal is completed as quickly as possible. Therefore, it is left to India, and I think that has been a subject of discussions between India and the United States, especially between Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad and our leadership, as to how to manage this transition in Afghanistan. The United States sees India as a major player for the future in Afghanistan, as a force of stability because of the influence that India enjoys on currently the two factions of the government, which is Ashraf Ghani and his chief rival Abdullah. But at the same time, India has also done a lot of development work in Afghanistan. It does not have a military presence, but at the same time, the cultural influence of India through its films and the exchange that has taken place with Afghans in the past has given it an ideal platform. Indians are liked in Afghanistan, and therefore whatever India says is listened to by the current government. I'm not sure whether the same applies to Taliban. So the United States would like India to bring about a meeting of minds between all the factions, which is a tall order. At the same time, the United States would like to see India as a peace broker by talking to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia in the region, all of them players in Afghanistan. Secondly, use its textual and political security force reform, building democratic institutions in transiting Afghanistan. And finally, of course, the United States would like the Indian civil society to actually talk to the Afghan civil society in order that they become strong enough to influence whoever is in government or in power in Afghanistan. So there are a lot of asks as far as India is concerned. And of course, India would like to preserve its influence and the investments that it has made. At least $3 billion have gone into investments in Afghanistan over time. And again, the support to medium and long-term foreign aid. For that, again, India would be seen as a fulcrum around which the others would rally. So there is an expectation from India that will provide the much-needed stability as a player and a partner of Afghanistan. But on the United States part also, I must say that total withdrawal is just not feasible. I think if the situation deteriorates in Afghanistan very rapidly, then of course the United States Congress will have to think twice and perhaps come back to Afghanistan in some form to prop up the government, or at least to stop the bloodshed if that happens in Afghanistan. So we have a very grim scenario in future.
Mr. Wadhwa, there's also been this talk that one of the reasons the US wants to pull out of Afghanistan is also we look at the Biden administration and a changing world order, and it seems like the United States focus in foreign policy today seems to be more dealing with an aggressive and assertive Russia, dealing with countries like North Korea and Iran, who both have nuclear programs, with the rise of China. Do you feel that this has also got to do with the United States also rethinking where it wants to focus as far as its foreign policy priorities are concerned? And maybe Afghanistan doesn't make it to that priority list today.
The foreign priorities of the United States today have changed, and the focus has changed. The United States is no longer longer looking at Middle East, leave alone Afghanistan with the same focus that it used to earlier. Its focus now is how to contain China in the Indo-Pacific and at the same time deal with an aggressive Russia with whom it seems to have developed a lot of antagonism over a number of policies as they see directed against the United States. So we are seeing actually a United States which is now going to adopt a more belligerent and competitive stance as far as Russia and China is concerned. That leaves very little room for places like Afghanistan to be focused upon. So it's up to the regional countries and up to Afghans themselves to make the best of the situation.
Mr. Wadhwa, we also have other players in the future of Afghanistan. We have China, we have Russia, we have Iran. Do you feel that India's relationships, bilateral ties, say with Iran, with Russia, these will also play a very important part in how India is further involved in the future of Afghanistan?
Each of these players have their own interests in Afghanistan. If you take Iran, for instance, it would not like Afghanistan to be used, for example, by Pakistan to destabilize Iran. That's the main issue there. Also to make sure that its connectivity projects with Afghanistan proceed so that it develops economically. Thirdly, also to make sure that the minorities with links to Iran are not mistreated by the Taliban. And this was the main concern that they had when the Taliban were in power earlier. The National Alliance then was supported by Iran, India and the Russians. With Russia, the main concern for the Russians in Afghanistan is the return to instability and terrorist elements in Afghanistan and the increase in ISIS presence in the country. And by making sure that they are on the right side of whoever governs Afghanistan, they are hoping that the efforts of the ISIS are not directed at Russia's underbelly and they are not affected by the instability and terrorism which can be propped up in Afghanistan if there is a wrong government in place. As far as India is concerned, it would not like Afghanistan to be used as a territory from where Pakistan can once again start proxy wars against India and not train terrorists in Afghanistan who can then be used against India in Kashmir and in other places. And as far as China is concerned, they would like peace and quiet to be prevalent in Afghanistan in their own interest so that their own restive region of Xinjiang is not affected. And for that, they need the support of Pakistan. So in all, I think Pakistan has emerged as a major player due to not its benign influence, but due to its nuisance value and also because of the fact that it has linkages with Taliban, which it can use for nefarious purposes. So we have a very volatile situation, a very dynamic and a moving situation, and therefore India needs to play its cards extremely well in this process.
Mr. Wadhwa, we also saw that it was in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks that the US troops landed in Afghanistan and the purpose initially was to fight off and finish Al-Qaeda. There's also this feeling prevalent today that the transnational terrorist threat that the US felt from Afghanistan has now ceased. And maybe this is now time for the United States to pull out its troops and focus on other conflict zones in the world. Would you agree with this analysis that the transnational terrorist threat to the United States from Afghanistan is kind of over now and the US can get its troops home, but they're committing that they will continue to play a humanitarian role in Kabul and they will continue helping Kabul? Do you think that is a workable solution in the near future?
The presence of United States and NATO troops in Afghanistan on the ground who were actually keeping a check on Taliban. And between 2017 to 19, if we look at the scenario, we find that the Taliban forces were pushed and the Afghan government got an upper hand. They gained a lot during that period in Afghanistan, mainly from the support and the presence of the United States and the NATO troops there. At the same time, there was development work being carried out by countries like India, which also helped the government. However, two issues have directly impacted the situation. One is the fact that in the United States itself, President Trump, in order to come back and win the elections, which happened last year, was very keen to have a popular foreign policy step. And one of the foreign policy steps that were very popular or seen to be popular at that time was the complete withdrawal of United States from Afghanistan, where he could tell the people and the Congress that he has brought back troops and that the wasteful expenditure, in inverted commas, of $140 $43 billion sunk into Afghanistan would soon come to an end, and that United States forces who had lost their lives in Afghanistan would no longer be doing so. So guided by that motivation, Zalmay Khalilzad was appointed, as I said, to open up talks with Taliban in order to make sure that there could be a transitional government in Afghanistan, which is a pipe dream in my view. The Taliban and the current government do not see eye to eye. In fact, the current government itself is divided. Afghanistan is divided politically, and there will never be any agreement in the foreseeable future on a transition government in which the current government steps down, because it's not a military government, it's not an imposed government, it's an elected government. And therefore, their demand is that they should remain in power. And at the end of it, if there is new elections, then of course they would be willing to cut down their term and agree to that process. So this is where we are at the moment. There's no meeting of minds on that. I don't see that happening by 9th of September, which is the 20th anniversary of the terror attacks, that there would be any agreement reached. And if that agreement is not reached, then the United States leaves Afghanistan. We are in for a period of instability in which we will see further attacks being intensified on civilians, on urban centers, and the people to suffer will be the people of Afghanistan.
And in the coming days, we will continue to follow the developments in Afghanistan with the U.S. decision to pull out and India's role and the role played by the U.S. With these thoughts, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your discussion on Leaders Summit on Climate. The participants are Dr. Shrikant K. Panigrahi, Director General of Indian Institute of Sustainable Development, and Renu Kataria, AIR Correspondent.
Good evening, listeners. Today we have with us Dr. Shrikant K. Panigrahi to discuss about Leaders Summit on Climate. Before we start our discussion, let us listen to the Prime Minister's address at the summit.
President Biden, distinguished colleagues, my fellow citizens of this planet, Namaskar. I would like to thank President Biden for taking this initiative. Humanity is battling a global pandemic right now, and this event is a timely reminder that the grave threat of climate change had not disappeared. In fact, climate change is a lived reality for millions around the world. Their lives and livelihoods are already facing its adverse consequences. Friends, for humanity to combat climate change, concrete action is needed. We need such action at a high speed, on a large scale, and with a global scope. We in India are doing our part. Our ambitious renewable energy target of 450 gigawatts by 2030 shows our commitment. Despite our development challenges, we have taken many bold steps on clean energy, energy efficiency, afforestation, and biodiversity. That is why we are among the few countries whose indices are 2 degrees Celsius compatible. We have also encouraged global initiatives like International Solar Alliance, LEAD IT, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Friends, as a climate responsible developing country, India welcomes partners to create templates of sustainable development in India. This can also help other developing countries who need affordable access to green finance and clean technologies. That is why President Biden and I are launching the India-US Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 Partnership. Together, we will help mobilize investments, demonstrate clean technologies, and enable green collaboration. Friends, today, as we discuss global climate action, I want to leave one thought with you. India's per capita carbon footprint is 60% lower than the global average. It is because of our lifestyle is still rooted in sustainable traditional practices. So today, I want to emphasize the importance of lifestyle change in climate action. Sustainable lifestyles and guiding philosophy of back to basic must be an important pillar of our economic strategy for the post-COVID era. Friends, I recall the words of the great Indian monk Swami Vivekananda. He called on us to arise, awake, and stop not until the goal is reached. Let us make this decade of action against climate change. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Panigrahi, while addressing today at the Leaders Summit on Climate, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, "This summit is a timely reminder that the grave threat posed by climate change has not disappeared even as humanity battles COVID pandemic." So what do you think will be India's proposals and actions in this summit to combat climate change?
India is a leader in climate change adaptation and mitigation right from the beginning. In our summit in 1992, on the eve of World Environment Day in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And that was the starting point of where United Nations Convention for Climate Change took birth. UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the nodal convention which is and the UN body responsible for center staging climate action at the global level involving the member countries. India is one of the front runners as a member country of UNFCCC, and in global platform India has always played a leadership role in a very dynamic way historically. India always keeps saying, I am also a part of the negotiation. We feel that we are not getting our right on carbon space. We have not responsible for the global emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that has already been accumulated in our atmosphere and which is the main cause of global warming. Our contribution, although is least in per capita term, as also the Prime Minister told today, India's contribution is 60% lower than the global average. Still, we are a country who believes in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We believe in all of us living together and want to see the planet to be a better place to live in. With that great universal brotherhood spirit, India is always in the forefront of climate change adaptation and mitigation. Right from our summit, India is very active. Right from Conference of Parties 1 to Conference of Parties 25, and that has been happened in different countries so far. And now the Conference of Parties 26 is coming in Glasgow, in Scotland of UK, where India will also be giving its leadership and positioning itself how the country has taken the turn. And India has already played a pivotal role in Kyoto Protocol, and it is one of the first countries not only to sign Kyoto Protocol but also to ratify Kyoto Protocol compared to China, USA and all the developed nations who are more responsible. But we have already shown our commitment, and not only shown, we have executed appropriate policies and programs, and we have shown the global leadership in the field of climate change so far. And here I think it is worth mentioning, India has also organized Conference of Parties 8, that is COP8 in New Delhi, where 6,219 participants throughout the globe participated, where around 23 crores were spent in 2002, November and December. And this is a historic event Government of India hosted in global interest, and we decided what is to be done, the future course of action for combating greenhouse gas emissions and make a planet better place in 2002. And subsequently in all the Conference of Parties, let it be in any part of the world, India has exhibited its own leadership. And so it is very important that Honorable Prime Minister has voiced Indian feelings and Indian sense of approach to the climate change in a very concise and precise manner in this prestigious virtual leadership summit on climate change, where US for the first time, I must appreciate President Biden and his leadership initiatives. First time a country who has already worked out and played a backbencher role in climate change negotiation right from the Earth Summit in 1992 has come up with a visionary statement that US will be cutting its greenhouse gas emission 50%. This is a great commitment, and India has told in a very profound manner its commitment for the future.
We also know that COP26 is very soon coming up in Glasgow in November this year. So why do you think this virtual summit before COP26, and what is the message that the United States is giving to the world by hosting the summit?
COP26 is one of the unfortunate COP which was scheduled to happen in 2020, and because in 2019 it happened in Madrid, where all the global leaders, the 196 member countries of UNFCCC, participated and voiced their climate actions. As per one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 13, that climate action, every country has prepared what is the kind of the climate action they will be taking. And in addition, in 2020, December 31st, the Kyoto Protocol come to an end. It was very unfortunate that in Kyoto Protocol, many developed nations has committed a lot of finance, technology and technology transfer to developing and underdeveloped world, which could not able to happen significantly. Or not only significantly, it was very mere and negligible. And so Kyoto Protocol failed miserably. Then with a different approach in Paris in 2015, November and December came forward, COP21, where India participated and India submitted its INDC, that is Intended National Determinant Contributions. What India is willing to do by 2030. So like this, all the member countries came up with their ambitions and their desire to play their role for the global commons, and that was widely discussed and approved in Paris Climate Change Convention and agreement, and it came in the shape of Paris Agreement and become NDCs, National Determinant Contributions. So in that NDC document, India has committed many important commitments which are unique, and that shows that India is committed much more than other competing nations who are responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions like China and USA or European Union. India has committed 40% of its energy basket will come from non-fossil fuel routes, that is renewable energy, hydro and nuclear, which is very promising commitment. So it is a very important time. COP26 is derailed. It has been postponed again and again. And now it is scheduled to happen from 1st November to 12th November in Scotland, that is in Glasgow of the UK. And the President-designate on behalf of government of UK, who gives the leadership to this COP26, is Alok Sharma. He is one of our colleagues from Delhi. And although he is having immigration of UK, and he is a UK citizen by now, and he is spearheading the global leadership to organize COP26, where net zero is the slogan. So by 2050, so all the member countries and all the nations of the world must commit that by 2050, all the greenhouse gas should be emitted. And India has also supported this view, but India has an opinion that 2050 is so far, and it is a very long commitment. Planet will lose, and a lot of negative impact the planet will witness to wait such a longer period. It should be even more aggressive. And let us not talk much about 2050, and let us discuss about 2030, which is in a very clear distance. And right from 15th of September 2015, for another 15 years, these SDGs have started rolling on. And so accordingly, the Paris Agreement is started operationalizing from 1st of January 2021. So unfortunately, COVID has impacted us to a greater extent. It has snatched away the climate finance. All the countries who has put their budget in their priority list to center stage the climate action, and most of these funds are diverted to tackle COVID, and that is very unfortunate. But our survival is very important for us as well as for our future generation. The whole world wish to see that climate change even much dangerous than COVID. COVID could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years phenomena, but climate change is constantly killing us last so many years, and it will be killing more aggressively. We have already reached at a temperature of 1.2 degrees centigrade, losing 30% of our global biodiversity. The cold currents has become hot currents. The global air pressure belts has been changed, and disasters has become very common. So there is no time to wait further. And it's a very, very crucial moment, not only for USA, but not for China, but not for European Union or India or any other, Australia or Japan. It is a very serious and a time of transition for the entire planet, for all the global citizens. COVID at the one time is a big challenge, and there is another challenge which is a slow poisoning system, and we need to tackle that aggressively too.
Thank you, sir, for coming on our show and discussing on climate issues.
Thank you.
You were listening.
Bring you a discussion on India-US cooperation from tackling climate change to COVID care. The participants are Anil Vadva, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Ambassador Vadva, when we see the India-US relationship, and we have seen this bilateral relationship develop over the last few years, there has been a lot of cooperation in defense, security. It's a strategic partnership. And now we also see this recent pact between India and the US on climate change and how both countries have committed to work for a greener future. And also the US standing shoulder to shoulder with India in the COVID thing. How do you think this then boosts the bilateral relationship?
I think you are right on both fronts. I think United States and India are cooperating quite closely. But I would like to point out that this is not as smooth as it seems on the surface. Because if you recall, when John Kerry, the special representative of the United States on climate, was in India, he had an extensive dialogue with a number of agencies. And it was during this visit, he was told how much India has done to actually make its mark on the climate front. So ranging from the International Solar Alliance and setting of the International Solar Alliance headquarters in India, but also the fact that India's per capita carbon footprint is actually 60% lower than the global average. And that is because India's lifestyle is rooted in sustainable traditional practices. So India is still following the philosophy of back to basics, which must be an important pillar of the economic strategy in the post-COVID era. Having said that, actually, India is targeting a 2030 GDP emissions intensity. So that is the volume of emissions per unit of GDP that is 33 to 35% below 2005 levels. And it also seeks to have 40% of power which is generated from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. And this is despite India's development challenges, that India has taken many bold steps on clean energy, on energy efficiency, afforestation and biodiversity. So that's why India is amongst a few countries whose nationally defined contributions are 2 degrees Celsius compatible. And this is exactly what was conveyed to Mr. John Kerry, and this is exactly what Prime Minister Modi also conveyed at the Climate Change Summit, which happened on the 22nd of April this year. So that's as far as climate is concerned. Now, we've had some statements which have been coming out of the United States on Saturday and Sunday last, which actually have come out fully in support of additional support for India amidst the COVID-19 surge. But we must have to see this in the background of what the initial response of the US official spokesperson was and the commotion that it caused within the United States and within India, because it was a flat statement about US foreign policy and how US interests were paramount in that regard. So after that, we've had some very encouraging statements from Mr. Blinken, and then we also had a conversation between Mr. Jake Sullivan and our National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval. And thereafter, we've seen that the United States has committed raw materials and vaccines, also the commitment to deploy officials, which will help in the COVID response in India, also arrangement of oxygen concentrators, for example. So raw material, therapeutics, tests, protective equipment, etc. And has also promised to airlift oxygen generators and concentrators, remdesivir, etc., which is the antiviral drug, from nearby bases. What's more important, though, is the promise that raw material will be provided for the manufacture of vaccine in the next 48 hours. This is in addition to the rapid diagnostic test kits. And if you recall, India has been asking for the need to lift these restrictions which have been imposed on the export of critical raw materials and equipment for some time now. In fact, the first virtual summit of the Quad leaders in March had talked about the need of the four nations to work together in vaccine production and delivery. But when it came to the crunch, all that India had received so far from the US was some silence, or defense of the already existing regulations in the United States, in which it was America first again. So that has been reversed, and the United States leadership has let go of that policy now, which must be welcomed in India.
Ambassador Wadhwa, you were talking about the climate summit which was attended by Prime Minister Modi, and it saw about 40 world leaders come together, and the US President hosted this virtual summit. We've also seen in the analysis that has come after the climate change summit, which has argued that a forward-looking policy has to envision green development in a new way. Funding has to be provided for the green technologies as compensation for the emissions space lost by poorer countries. Do you feel that this is an issue that richer nations understand, that when countries like India are trying to opt for technologies which are greener, which will help keep the environment clean and fight climate change, are they willing to make that monetary contribution also?
This is a struggle that the developing countries have faced for quite some time now, despite the fact that there is a global compact on this principle that there would be partnerships to create templates for sustainable development in the developing countries, because they need affordable access to green finance and also to clean technologies. However, that's not been forthcoming so far, and the tendency has been to actually paper over those agreements and to move forward with setting new standards of global emissions. So it was at this summit on 22nd April, therefore, that Prime Minister Modi actually launched a energy and climate partnership with President Joe Biden at the Leaders Summit on Climate. And the main focus of this document was that India, as a climate responsible developing country, welcomes its partners to create templates for sustainable development in India. And also this is in keeping with the past promises of developed countries, because developing countries need affordable access, as I said, to green finance and clean technologies. So India-US Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership document is basically aimed to help mobilize investments to demonstrate clean technologies and enable this green collaboration. And its aim would be to, in fact, demonstrate and scale innovative clean technologies which are needed to decarbonize important sectors. That includes industry, transportation, power, and buildings, and then build the capacity to measure and to manage and adapt to the risks of climate change related impacts. Obviously, in future, this will have to proceed along two tracks. One is the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership and the Climate Action and Finance Mobilization Dialogue, which will then build on and subsume a range of existing processes. And this is what has been agreed upon. It's a very far-reaching agreement as far as India is concerned. But the fact remains that India is, as I said earlier, amongst very few developing countries whose nationally defined contributions are 2 degrees Celsius compatible. And it's also aimed at achieving the Paris Agreement's objective of keeping the global warming to considerably below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is why the promise that India has made of targeting a 2030 GDP emissions intensity that is 33 to 35% below 2005 levels, and to have 40% of power generated from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. These are both important promises which India is keeping up to till now.
Ambassador Wadhwa, we have seen President Joe Biden come and he has reversed many of the policies of the previous US President Donald Trump, who had very famously also called climate change a hoax. We've seen President Biden change the rules. He has also promised cuts in emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030 over 2005 levels. The point is that a lot of people say that transfer of technologies will have to take place for the India-US agreements to yield results. Do you feel that the fact that President Biden and Prime Minister Modi both are showing the political will and leadership to take this forward, and we would see these very substantive changes, which is the fact that the US institutions are willing to share knowledge and subsidize transfer of technologies? Do you feel that we should feel optimistic about the way forward?
Well, we've had an extensive dialogue on this issue, which we discussed just now during the visit of Mr. John Kerry to India, where all these issues of climate finance were discussed right there. And the proof of pudding is in its eating. We've had a number of agreements which have been reached verbally during this visit. Then, of course, now we have this document, which is India-US Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 Partnership. And I said this is going to replace a number of ongoing dialogues. The most important issue in this is how much of technology flows and how much of finance is going to come to India from the United States and how that is going to be made available. So we've got to keep talking, and there is no reason not to feel optimistic about it, because it's not as if India is turning its back away on the targets for climate change, which the United States is now favoring a lot in the new administration under President Biden, which is not the case under President Trump. But since India has already been a support of the Paris Agreement along with France and also a co-founder of the International Solar Alliance, it is in the forefront of the fight against climate change. And don't forget that India, China, United States are all big countries who matter a lot to the issue of climate change. And the United States would certainly like to have India on board, especially in the changed circumstances where India is seen as a valued partner across the board over a range of issues. And therefore, on climate, of course, the United States would like to work with India and also accommodate its interests.
Mr. Wadhwa, we've also seen the statements coming out of the US recently. We had the US President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris both have assured India and the people of India that the US will provide all assistance, including urgently needed medical supplies and equipment to help India combat the outbreak of the corona pandemic. And President Biden has also tweeted that just as India sent assistance to the United States as our hospitals were strained early in the pandemic, we are determined to help India in its time of need. How do you see this outreach by the US, especially as you had also pointed out earlier, we did see the United States being a little more cautious and there was this America first thing. But do you feel that maybe sense has prevailed and the world getting together, just like India was willing to share the vaccine, the US realizes the value of that cooperation, and we have the US now stepping up and reaching out to India just the way India did?
Let me get back to what I said earlier on this issue, because just a few days ago, the response from the U.S. official spokesperson was something which did not evoke good responses in neither India nor in the United States, because I think what has happened is that across the social, political and business spectrum in the United States itself, there has been criticism for the perceived indifference to India, which has been reeling under a COVID-19 wave. So the Biden-Harris dispensation actually, in my view, jolted into action this Sunday, pledging to commandeer all possible supplies and resources to help India in its struggle to contain the pandemic. And that is why you had that statement from President Biden, who said that the United States is determined to help India in its time of need. And he has recalled that India also stepped up the plate and helped the United States in its times of need. And this, of course, followed the conversation between the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Mr. Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor of India, where he said that the United States is deeply concerned by the severe COVID outbreak in India and that they were working around the clock to deploy more supplies and support to the friends and partners in India as they bravely battled this pandemic. On Saturday, we had a conversation between the External Affairs Minister of India and also the Secretary of State of the United States. So that was also a meaningful conversation in which the damage which was done by that statement of the official spokesperson was undone pretty quickly. And I think it's only because of the fact that the leadership in the United States realizes that India is an important partner and it has to be supported in times of need. Also an important partner with regard to partnership in the Quad for vaccine development. And that's why we've had this landmark change of decision or a change of heart, if you might call it, where we now have assurance that there will be lifting of restrictions imposed on the export of critical raw materials and equipment for vaccine production in India.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the India-US cooperation in various areas, including the US assistance to India as India grapples with the pandemic at home. With this, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.